Hi, guys. Welcome to today's live stream. It is Sunday afternoon. I'm right here in Phoenix, Arizona. Looking forward to diving into your questions. I've got my coffee here. I got my water, ready to rock and roll. For those of you who haven't checked out Rebel Capitalist Pro, you've got to do so. That is the online investing website forum that I have with pros Lynn Alden and Chris McIntosh. It is absolutely awesome, incredible research that'll help take your investing to the next level. We do live stream Q&As. You're going to absolutely love it. You got to check it out today at georgegammon.com/pro. My marketing guy, Gene, has a $1 trial offer. You can't beat it. Go to georgegammon.com/pro. and check it out. All right, there's my pitch for the beginning of the live stream. Now let me get into your questions. I'm gonna go all the way up to the top and see what we got here. And if you guys do have a question, make sure you start with the word question in capital letters. It helps me see it a lot easier. George, how many real estate units can you comfortably manage yourself? Richard, that really depends. Like for me, none, because I don't want to put in any effort, like zero. I don't even want to barely put in the effort to manage the property manager. But there's some people like my good buddy Jason Hartman, who has, he's got to have at least 20 or 30 properties that he self-manages from Florida. And those properties, I know he owns a couple in Florida, but most of his properties are outside of the state, and he does it easily by himself. So it's all about having a really good handyman locally, and then making sure your properties are in the right areas. Here's the bottom line. If you've got a bunch of properties in like C neighborhoods and you're doing Section 8 housing and all, and you're kind of a slumlord, there's no way. You got to be on top of that yourself. Then you got to be on top of your property manager. It's a full-time job. It's not a passive investment. It's a business. But if you've got some properties in A neighborhoods, even starter homes in A neighborhoods where quality families that are raising their children want to be because of the school district, it's very realistic to manage those on your own. Now there's going to be a learning curve, like everything else. But if you've got a good handyman that you can trust, and you've got a few of those properties in the same area, it's very doable for sure. Question: in the 1860s, did we not have a central bank but had the worst recession? Well, you went through the Civil War. Yeah, I think that has got to count for something. All right, let me keep going here. In the 1950s, the tax rates were 74%, but the economy was booming. Please explain these scenarios. Well, okay, first of all, you had a civil war in the 1860s. So, and by the way, how are you measuring a quote unquote recession? If you're just measuring recession by a deflationary measurement, that might not be the best way to look at it. I would assume you're looking at nominal GDP, which is fine. But then again, you got to keep in mind, you can't expect nominal GDP to boom when you're in the middle of a civil war. And then as far as the 1950s and the 74% tax rate, yeah, but see, you're making a mistake, Nicholas, in assuming that because there was a 74% highest marginal tax rate, that affected tax receipts. And it didn't. Look at the tax receipts as a percentage of GDP. And what you'll see going back to the 1940s, regardless of the highest marginal rate, the amount of revenue the IRS collects as a percentage of GDP pretty much stays the same. Whether the highest marginal rate is 90% or whether it's 25%, like it was in the late 1980s. You see, so a lot of people like to look at that time frame and say, oh, look at how great the economy was. Yeah, but they're, again, implying that the tax revenue as a percentage of GDP was a lot higher because of those rates, and it was not. So make sure you're comparing apples to apples there and actually looking at the numbers and the statistics that matter. And that's the tax receipts as a percentage of GDP, not necessarily the highest marginal rate. George, if you can please do a rebel capitalist show for dummies, count me in. Think about how many people that would subscribe and pay for your show. Well, I don't know what other topics I would go into, Ed. I think hopefully what I do is try to interview people that are really super smart and do it in a way that most everyone can understand. If you combine those interviews with the Rebel Capitalist show with my whiteboard videos, that's kind of the objective. So hopefully if you watch those whiteboard videos along with those interviews, you'll be able to really learn a lot. What is your opinion of tips? Basically, bonds that are inflation adjusted. I think it's okay. Thank you for all your. It's just they're going to understate inflation, so you're not going to be paid the rate at which the goods and services you're trying to buy with that purchasing power is going up in price. I mean, let me tell you a little story. As you guys know, I don't spend much time in the United States, and I've spent the last couple months here in Phoenix. And the other day, I went to some fast food place. I drove through Chick-fil-A, and I got like a sandwich, like a grilled chicken sandwich, and like one of these little, it's like a little cup of yogurt. It was like, here's my coffee. Like it wasn't even this big. It was like maybe that big, just a little cup of yogurt like this. And the yogurt was like $6. It was like $5.50. And I look at my bill just for a little grilled chicken sandwich and a cup of yogurt. And the bill was like $12 or $13. I'm like, what is going on here? Like how can anybody claim that there isn't some significant price inflation? And then my health insurance group called me or emailed me the other day to say that my rates were going up by like $150 per month. I'm just like, what? How is there no inflation? Like on what planet? So you get my point. My point is, although the CPI may be 2% or whatever it is, that is total nonsense when you look at the price of your actual expenses and what you have to spend daily to get by. So that's what I would place my focus on. And that's why I don't think tips are that great of a deal. I mean, it's better than the alternative as far as if your only other alternative is just straight bonds. But I think you got a lot better ways to invest your money out there. I'm not sure I'm following that question. Okay, if the USD devalues, what effect on Latin American currencies, Mexican peso, and the cost of living? Well, Alvaro, what are your expenses denominated in, right? So if your expenses are denominated in pesos, if the USD devalues, what effect on the Latin American currencies? The cost of living. Yeah, I'm not sure if you're talking about the cost of living in the United States or the cost of living in Mexico. I mean, if the Mexican peso goes up in value relative to the dollar, then if your income and your expenses are denominated in pesos, I don't know that it affects your cost of living that dramatically, other than the products that you're buying that Mexico is importing from the United States. The cost of those are most likely going to go down over the long term. So, I mean, it's going to reduce your cost of living, if anything, but I don't know to what degree. And then if you're talking about from the United States, the cost of living, I mean, the cost of living will go up because the United States imports the majority of the goods it consumes. Question: if the USD went into hyperinflation, with it being the reserve currency, would that automatically push every other currency pegged to the dollar in a way into hyperinflation? Well, I don't know that they'd be able to hold the peg. I don't. Let's see. I mean, it's all a matter of what degree, Mark. You talk about the USD going into hyperinflation. I mean, it's very unlikely that it goes into a Venezuela type of situation, but I think you could see it go from 89 down to, talking about the DXY, down to 70, down to 50. Who knows? I don't know that would dramatically affect. And what it would really affect are the countries who have a lot of dollar-denominated debt, because they would they'd be dancing in the streets because their cash flows are increasing massively relative to their debt burden. Because let's say you have a dollar-denominated loan and your cash flow is in Colombian pesos or Mexican pesos, like we just talked about, and your Mexican pesos are gaining in value, they're doubling in value. That just means the burden of your debt just got cut in half. And so you'd be dancing in the streets. But as far as the currencies that are pegged, I mean, if it just went into hyperinflation, they'd have to break the peg. And then I don't know that they would be dramatically affected. I'd have to think that through from a standpoint of their FX reserves. I don't think they would have too big of an issue, because the big issue is if the dollar went the other way and in defending their currency, because then you'd have an issue of FX reserves. I mean, but then, then you got a carry trade that you'd have to think about there. And then you'd have to think about interest rates. There would be some serious market distortions. That's for sure. As far as what they would be, I'd have to think it through and do a whiteboard video on it, or just get it on my legal pad right here, Mark. But interesting question. That's for sure. But I don't know that I'd look at it in terms of hyperinflation. I do it as maybe a thought experiment, but understand the probabilities are relatively low. But the probabilities are a lot higher that it goes down to maybe 60 or 50 on the DXY. So I think your mental bandwidth would be better allocated to thinking about what happens if the dollar goes down to 50 on the DXY, compared to what happens if we get Venezuela type of hyperinflation with the US dollar. Why am I long Bitcoin? Well, I think the bull argument is very well known. I'm not going to state that again. I mean, long term, I'm bullish. Short term, I'm a little hesitant. Whenever you see Bitcoin or Grayscale occupying 99% of the commercials on CNBC, I tend to get a little hesitant. I just don't I get very uneasy when everyone likes the investment I like. I don't know. Ever since I was a kid, I don't like everyone agreeing with me. I like disagreeing with everyone. That's where I feel most comfortable. It's the rebel capitalist, right? So short term, I think there's quite a bit of emotion driving Bitcoin right now. And I think a lot of people aren't really investing. I think they're emotionally investing, which is something different. But long term, I see a lot of asymmetry there. As far as governments banning it, it all depends on how popular Bitcoin gets. I spoke to Raoul Paul about this, and he believes the more adoption, and actually Eric Townsend has this same view, the more adoption it gets, the harder it would be to ban. Because if you've got something that every single pension fund owns, how do you ban that? Maybe you could, but it would be a lot more difficult. And then people could go to a different country. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. I think there's a lot of room for it to grow between now and then. I would be more concerned, or I am more concerned about how much emotional buying is going into Bitcoin right now than I am governments banning it. Obviously, the probability of either is above zero, but yeah, I think that's how I'd really look at it. And one thing we need to understand, and I've been saying this in a lot of podcasts that I've been doing, is and this holds true for gold as well. When we think about Bitcoin and gold long term, or when we think about having to completely redo the global monetary system, which is what we're going to need to get back to sustainable quality GDP growth globally. And this goes back to a lot of my conversations with Jeff Snyder, and that I completely agree with him that you're not going to get sustainable GDP growth, quality growth, where we're increasing the amount of goods and services available and being produced by a society in an efficient manner. We're not going to get back to that until we have a new monetary system, period. So, and I think we're not going to get back to that until we have a new regulatory system as well. And now maybe there's countries that are deregulating and going in the right direction where you're going to have a lot of capital flows. And that's something we talk about a lot in Rebel Capitalist Pro with Chris McIntosh. He's really got his finger on the pulse of where he believes capital is going to be flowing in the future as a result of things like the Great Reset that we've been talking about with Klaus and Bigglesworth and everyone at the World Economic Forum and the IMF. That is, if that game plan, if that agenda, if they execute on that, that's going to be a reduction of the amount of economic output we have from a standpoint of goods and services. So no matter how much currency units you can pump out of thin air, the society as a whole gets poorer as a result. So, my point here is I think people should be looking at macroeconomics, not just from a standpoint of what the monetary system is going to look like, but also the amount of wealth that is gained or lost by our ability to produce goods and services, right? So it goes back to Bitcoin and gold being perfect money, right? And a lot of people think, oh my gosh, if we could just get back onto a gold standard, or oh my gosh, if Bitcoin was just global money and that was it, we didn't have any fiat currency. If Bitcoin can just be this Trojan horse that people start to adopt, and before the governments can do anything about it, all of a sudden it's taken over the world, it's going to solve all of our problems. And it's going to be this new global monetary system we need to start from scratch and build on a solid foundation. I don't know. Because at the end of the day, and I've talked to Raul about this, I've talked to Jeff about this, I've talked to a lot of people who are way smarter than I am, and we all come to the same conclusion. And that conclusion is you can have perfect money, but if perfect money is owned by imperfect creatures in an imperfect world, we can't expect perfect money to perform perfectly. And so I think Bitcoin has a lot of asymmetry. I think it's a great speculation long term, but I don't think it's a panacea. And I don't think gold is a panacea. I think it's better than our current system, but it's not a silver bullet that just fixes everything. And if you want to think through what a Bitcoin world may look like, just go back to gold. And when we had full reserve banking, and when we went from that to free banking, and then the banks were nationalized before the Civil War, and then central banking in 1913, and then think through what happened at Bretton Woods in 1944 and why that spawned the euro-dollar system we have today that completely broke down in 2008. Go through that whole thought process and then just plug in Bitcoin for gold. And I realize it would be more decentralized. We wouldn't have the banking system, or maybe not as big of a banking system, because you wouldn't really have a need to store all your gold. But at the end of the day, if we have a war, if we have a national disaster, you're going to have people creating Bitcoin IOUs just like they created gold IOUs. And people forget fractional reserve banking is not a construct of the government. That is a construct of free banking and the actual private sector. It's a construct of the free market. So I think we need to remember that for sure. Why do you think Australian houses are overpriced? Well, Michael, just look at a chart. Just look at it. This, I mean, this is a very fair question. I don't want to belittle the question, but I think it shines a light on maybe a mistake that we fall prey to as investors, and I would throw myself into that category as well. And that is we try to focus on which direction the price is going, and we try to kind of rationalize. Well, this is like, it's an example. Let's use Tesla, right? You could have the same argument. Well, how can Tesla, the price be too high? How can it be overpriced when the whole world is moving to electrification? We're going to have all of these self-driving taxis. They're going to be Teslas. Tesla is a data company. It's a play on autonomous driving, and that's the direction the whole world is going, and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's cheap. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to buy $1 for $3, hoping it goes to $5. Some people have made a lot of money doing that. But I personally, I don't like that. I like buying $1 for 50 cents. So I like buying housing in the United States, as an example. In 2012, when you look at a historic chart of housing adjusted for inflation in the United States going back to 1900, and it's below or very close to its historic trend line, but the cash flows are insanely cheap, right? There's nothing cheap right now, historically speaking, adjusted for inflation, about the Australian housing market. It is quite the opposite. Now, you can sit there and tell me, oh, maybe it's an escape for the euro, the dollar, the weather's great, all these things that may give it tailwind. But the bottom line at the end of the day is you are not buying $1 for 50 cents. You are buying $1 for probably $10, hoping that it goes to $10.25. And I've got another term for that. It's called picking up nickels in front of a steamroller. That's what I think you're doing there. So just try to maybe just readjust, or I shouldn't say that, because I don't want to seem like I'm not a pro, I'm an amateur. But if you were a family member, Michael, I would suggest maybe thinking about in terms not necessarily of price, but is it cheap or is it expensive? And if it's cheap, buy it. If it's expensive, sell it. Right now, Aussie housing market, super expensive. Do I own property in Canada? No. Same reason I wouldn't buy property in Australia. There's too many great opportunities out there. I mean, that's one great thing about the time frame we're living in right now compared to prior to the cerveza sickness. And prior to the cerveza sickness, there was very little that was cheap. Now there's tons of stuff, maybe not dominated in dollars, but lots of real estate around the world is getting cheaper. The RV ratios are much more sane. There's commodity producers that are cheap, a hell of a lot cheaper in March, that's for sure, in April. But there's a lot better. There's a lot of opportunity out there. I don't think you have to put your money into these things like bonds that are at 5,000-year highs, or in Canadian real estate. There's if you just get outside of that box, I think you're going to find a lot of really cheap stuff that's going to have a lot less downside and a lot more upside long term. Okay, I got a question. I got a feeling I skipped over a lot of questions here. Is Agenda 21 something relevant? Yeah, but I mean, it's right along the lines of the Great Reset agenda. So it's the same type of stuff. So I'm just focusing on the Great Reset agenda. And it's good to see a lot of people are talking about that now that are more mainstream. I was just listening to Tom Woods' podcast, and I'm a big fan of Tom Woods. And he was talking to someone about the cerveza sickness who was a lot more mainstream. And this gentleman was talking about Klaus and the World Economic Forum. And he was talking about how many of the supporters, quote unquote, of the World Economic Forum are pharmaceutical companies and trying to connect the dots. And I'm like, great, people are talking about it. It's good. The best disinfectant for bad ideas is sunlight. We all just have to remember that. I think I just passed over a ton of questions, guys, so I'm going back up here. Bear with me. Where can I get information to base upcoming property purchase in Texas? I just go to Google. That's where I get all the charts and graphs for my whiteboard videos. It's I don't subscribe to any special service or Bloomberg terminal or anything like that. So what I would do is I would just look at historic housing prices, Texas, or historic housing prices, Dallas, adjusted for inflation. That's where I'd start. And then I'd go to Zillow and look in the area where you're thinking about buying and looking at the prices and then comparing them to the rents. And you can get a pretty darn good idea what the RV ratios are. And that's where I'd start. Yeah. So are you still bullish in Medellin real estate? I live in Medellin currently, own two properties, I'm assuming. I'm thinking about buying a third. Yeah, I am. I mean, I was more bullish like a few months ago when the dollar was like what 3,800, almost 4,000, and we were getting some fire sales. This was just before I left. I was in Provenza. There is where I have most of my properties, and that's where I was staying. That's where I was in lockdown, and I got that humanitarian flight to Fort Lauderdale and went to St. Bart's. But prior to leaving, I mean, as you know, James, the way you find properties or good deals in Medellin is by walking around or going around on your scooter or something and looking for sale signs in the window. It's kind of hard for us to understand that in the United States, that there's really not an MLS and that only 10, 20% of the properties that are for sale are actually online. And those are usually very overpriced. But I remember seeing a lot more for sale signs and some good properties, some awesome buildings. So I know that there were some motivated sellers, a lot more than normal. And as you know, too, if you've gone back and looked at a chart of housing adjusted for inflation, you'll see that prices really haven't moved too much since late 1990s. And people who live in Medellin are just shocked at that because everyone, oh my gosh, it's in a bubble, it's in a bubble, it's in a bubble. Well, they just think that it's in a bubble because they've just been there since 2000, call it 16, and they've just seen the nominal prices go up by 5 or 6% per year. And so in their mind, they think, oh my gosh, it has to be in a bubble. And they don't even look at the numbers adjusted for inflation. And when you see the numbers adjusted for inflation, you're like, oh, it really hasn't gone up, maybe 1-2%. And then when you take it back to the late 90s, because you've got that time frame in there in the early 2000s where it went down, so you adjust for how much it went down, and then it's going back up and up and up and up. But yeah, it's just getting back to a high water mark. And then you see that on the numbers that I did, it had only increased in real terms like 10% since about 2000. And that was going back to like 2020 or maybe 2019. So and then you got to look at it on a per square foot, or excuse me, per square meter relative to Bogota, relative to Cartagena, and then take it and compare it to Buenos Aires or Santiago, Lima, another, Panama City, something like that. And my goodness. And then look at the price per income. The price to income is very, very low. So on several metrics, I think it's, and then look at the RV ratios. And I understand that in a lot of places that are built up like Sabinette, and your RV ratios are garbage. And if you're a gringo coming down there and paying gringo prices, if you don't know what you're doing, yeah, you're not going to be able to get a good RV ratio. You're going to way overpay. You're going to get your butt handed to you. You're going to lose money. And 99 out of 100 times, you're going to lose money if you're a gringo that goes down there that doesn't know what you're doing. But if you've got that local expertise, if you know what you're doing, if you know how to buy right, then you're going to make a ton of money by finding those motivated sellers, building equity, forced appreciation, and then just renting it out. I mean, I can get over a 1% RV ratio there in Provenza, in an area that's got a lot more liquidity. So I'm still very bullish, but the disclaimer is I'm only bullish if you're a local expert. If you're not a local expert, don't even try. Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. And if you want some local expertise, you're more than welcome to use my team that I have used there since 2015. That's the way that you can kind of use the cheat code, if you will, to where you can still invest in there, and you can be a local expert by leveraging my team. And I don't get paid or anything like that, but if you just want to email my assistant, her email address is contact@georgegammon.com, and just ask for Angie and Joaquin's WhatsApp number. She'll give it to you, and they'll be back in town probably mid-January. They're visiting family now, but they're the husband and wife team that manages my whole operation down there. Joaquin is my architect, and Angie is my designer. And then if we do a rental property, Angie manages the property and does all the rental stuff. So just if you want to just reach out to them, and even if you don't use them, they'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, let's see what's next. California already limits water usage to 55 gallons per household, getting to 50 in 2030. Well, I mean, if you're asking what's next for California, one thing I know for certain is it's insanity. I don't know exactly what's coming down the pipeline there, but I know that it's going to be completely insane. And I know that I want absolutely nothing to do with it. That is for sure. I don't know about this latest water thing. I mean, as far as the electricity situation there, you're living in a third world country. I mean, I live in Medellin. I live in the coast of Ecuador. In the coast of Ecuador, Montanita, a little surfing village of 1,000 people, the electricity was more reliable than it is in LA right now. So, I mean, look at your cost benefit analysis of living in California. I mean, my goodness, people say, oh, well, yeah, the weather and the beach. Listen, I've been all over the world, and there's some beautiful beaches. There's some beautiful weather in this world outside of California, believe it or not. My goodness gracious. And you just look at what your downside is there, and just having to deal with the homeless population and the taxes and the traffic and the electricity and now the water and the property taxes. And I know they're not high now, but my guess is they'll be going up quite significantly. And it just doesn't make any sense to live there. It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And that's why you're seeing a lot of people move. You know, what's interesting too is I had this conversation with my sister the other day who lives in Dallas, Texas. And she was talking about all the people from California flooding in to Texas and voting the same way that they voted in California. They're going to turn California into Texas, or excuse me, Texas into California. But then we were laughing about it and we're like, okay, that's on one hand. But on the other hand, if enough people move out of California, then all the crazy people leave, and then all the smart people can go back and start from scratch. So maybe long term, I'm actually bullish on California. Once all the crazy people leave and you get rid of all these knucklehead politicians and you're able to hit the, I don't want to say the reset button. That's too Klaus-ish. But you just hit the start over button, we'll call it. And then, hey, you got a great place to live. So maybe 10 years, 20 years, that's what we can expect from California. I'm just extremely bearish on the now until then, because I think it's going to get a heck of a lot worse before it gets better. All right. Real Vision did a short documentary about fine dark rum being an alternative investment like scotch with tremendous upside potential. What are your thoughts? Yeah, I mean, maybe. I just, again, I there's so many things that I would rather invest in, and I don't know that that's going to pay you to own it. So I wouldn't consider it an investment. I'd consider it a speculation. And I don't know if I really have an edge there. And if I don't have an edge, I don't really like to get involved too much. But it's just a speculation. And then I'd wonder about liquidity, like who's your buyer on that? It just seems like it could be something like raw land where you kind of get stuck, and I don't know. I just think there's a lot of other, it's interesting, like fine art, but I just think there's so many other speculations out there that where I'd rather be right now and that are quote unquote cheap. So I'd rather start in something like uranium. Isn't inflating dollar the easiest way out of the current and future crisis? Yeah, I mean, it is, but it doesn't get you out of the crisis, because you've got to remember what is the crisis, right? And what you're doing is in my opinion, you're making a little bit of a mistake in that you're assuming the crisis is debt. And at face value, it would seem that way. But I would argue the crisis isn't necessarily the debt. The crisis is the distortions in the economy that racking up all that debt produced, right? That's just like that whiteboard video I did the other day on doing a debt jubilee in Japan, because the Bank of Japan owns 60% of government debt. So if you've got all those JGBs that are assets on the central bank's balance sheet and liabilities on the government's balance sheet, why not just come in, you hit the delete button, and who would ever know? Like, if they didn't announce it, would anyone even know? Because you're only affecting those two balance sheets, and it's just an electronic digital entry. But my argument was maybe the yen doesn't tank, maybe it does. Maybe the economy doesn't implode, but the damage has been done. There's no going back. The damage was done when you took the debt from, let's call it 100% of GDP up to 250% or wherever it is now, because of how that distorts and destroys the economy by misallocating resources. And the example I used was a heroin addict that runs up $100,000 credit card bill buying heroin to become an addict. Well, if you come in and give that person a debt jubilee, does that help them out? Is it, hey, your debt's gone? No, because the damage was all the heroin that they did to accumulate the $100,000 in debt. In fact, I would argue they're worse off because now they've got a clean balance sheet where they can go out and buy another $100,000 worth of heroin and just become worse of an addict and destroy their body even more than they've already destroyed it, their body and mind. And it's the same exact thing with the economy. The economy has done all of those drugs, and that's how they accumulated the debt. So just by taking the balance sheet, it doesn't unhook the economy from the drugs. And think about all the zombie corporations in Japan right now. Do those go away if you have a debt jubilee? No, they're still there. And think about right now in the United States. So we say, oh, well, we've got 27 trillion in debt and all the, 5 trillion deficit. Yeah, I get it. And oh, if we could just get rid of the debt problem. Well, is that really the problem when government spending is almost 60% of the entire economy? Government spending is almost 60% of GDP. 60. So the private sector only accounts for 40% of total economic output. So even if we got rid of the 27 trillion in debt, does that somehow change the fact that the private sector only accounts for 40% of economic output? No. If anything, it makes it worse because now the Fed's balance sheet is free, the federal government, their balance sheet is clear to go ahead and run up another 27 trillion in debt. And who knows where we get to then. Is the government, do they account for 90% of the economy? If so, if the wealth is measured by the amount of goods and services a society can produce efficiently, which I think it is, and it's not measured by M1 money supply or M2 money supply or whatever. Who cares how many green currency units you have in your bank account if there are no goods and services to buy? Right? It's that whole desert island type thing. If you've got $1 billion on a desert island, are you rich or poor? You're poor because all you got is a coconut and some salt water, regardless of how many billions of dollars you have. Right? So that's really the way I think we need to look at the wealth or lack thereof in the economy. And it doesn't have, it's wiping away the debt doesn't solve that problem. And then, of course, you've got to look at the Eurodollar system. You've got to look at the global monetary system. That's broken. And getting rid of the debt doesn't fix that. It's still the broken Eurodollar system that we need to figure out how to resolve or how to create a new system. And why is that important? Because in order to create more global GDP or more wealth, let's use that term. In order to create more wealth, we have to create more goods and services. That requires capital. That requires banks lending to those entities out there that are that have demand for productive loans. And when I mean productive loans, I mean people that can take that additional capital that's created by the banking system or whomever and turn that into goods and services created at a profit that's sustainable, that's creating jobs and creating a higher standard of living for everyone. Right? So now that system is totally broken. And you have to have that system in place in order for economies to grow and to become more wealthy. Right? So that's what I'd suggest you focusing on instead of maybe just focusing on the debt, because that's really a symptom. That's not the core problem, in my opinion. What are my thoughts on raw land? I don't like raw land, and it's illiquid, and I just don't like owning anything that's as an investment that doesn't pay you to own it. That's why I define that as that's how I define an investment, as something that has to pay you to own it. So I would see raw land as a speculation, but you're going to have to wait a long time, very illiquid. I think you've got a lot better options out there. I don't like raw land. 14% expansion in M1 in the past 6 weeks. How comes no one's talking about this? Well, I'm just about ready to do a video on it as far as the dollar collapsing, if you want to call it that. It's getting down to 89 handle. I mean, historically, it's still kind of in a quote unquote normal range, but obviously the trajectory is down. We could have a bounce back up. I'm going to talk to Brent Johnson about it on Wednesday, a good buddy of mine. But yeah, I mean, you're seeing M1 go parabolic, and I think that's why there's a lot of downward pressure on the dollar. That's going to have winners and losers. We talked about some of the winners, and that being countries and corporations that have a lot of dollar-denominated debt. It takes a lot of that debt burden off of their shoulders when they've got cash flow coming in different currencies or currencies other than the dollar. As far as why no one is talking about it, who knows? I think people are so caught up in the latest, Tesla or Bitcoin or something. And I don't want to talk disparagingly about those two assets. I'm not here to say they're good or bad or whatever. But the bottom line is if everyone is talking about this, there's a lot of buzz around something, it gets ratings, right? So the CNBCs and the Bloombergs and the financial media, they're going to talk about whatever gets the most ratings. And right now, Bitcoin gets the most ratings, and the increase in the money supply doesn't. Ironically, they're connected. So you'd think they would be talking about the increase in M1. But I think kind of, Brian, because everyone thinks that inflation is dead. At least everyone in the mainstream thinks inflation is dead. And therefore, who cares about the money supply? Because we could increase the money supply by 800% in 1 week, and it wouldn't matter because we'll never see inflation again for the rest of our lives. And, I'd argue that that may not be true. Okay, so here, what do you expect to happen with real estate and markets in countries other than the U.S. that use only U.S. dollars, like Panama, Ecuador? I would not invest in Ecuador. I would stay away from Ecuador. They're just well. First of all, I think they may still have that 5% capital controlled, where if you take your money out of the country, they charge you 5%, and that's just nonsense. And you got to ask yourself, if a country is willing to do something that draconian, do you really want to put capital to work there? The answer is probably no. I don't like Ecuador. I still have property there. I still have raw land there. That's one of the one or two things where I've actually lost money since I started investing in 2012. I've made a lot of money on net balance, but I have had, let's call them quote unquote investments, where I've got my butt handed to me. And one of them is with a land purchase, oceanfront property in Arizona, or excuse me, in Ecuador. Gorgeous property. But I think you got, go to Colombia, man. I could go there 1,000 times over. And if you want something where you don't have a lot of currency risk, I would look at Dubai, because they're pegged to the dollar. I believe it's 3.67 of their, was it dirhams is their currency? And so 3.67 dirhams to the dollar. And that's a peg. And so it'd be just basically like using the dollar to a certain extent. But it's super cheap, and you're going to have a much freer market there. And then Panama is overpriced too. When you look at the cost per square meter, my goodness gracious. So I just think that there's other markets where you've got a lot less downside and a lot more upside. And as most of you know, my game plan was to be in Dubai right now. That was the game plan. But I came to Phoenix just to help out a family member. But as soon as I get done here, then I'm off to Dubai. And I'm going to go there to look at real estate for myself. So obviously, I'll keep you guys filled in, and this scene will probably change if I get an Airbnb there or something like that. But I'll keep you guys posted on what I'm finding. I could go there and start kicking tires and hate it. I mean, don't think that I can't change my mind. I don't stay married to any idea at all. And I'm completely area agnostic. But right now, there's some macro things there that I think look great. So stay tuned, and I'll keep you guys posted. And if I do think it's a good place to invest, I will suggest it. But I can promise you that if I'm suggesting it, that I will be investing there with my own money first. I wouldn't tell anybody to do anything that I'm not doing with my own money. Why is it so bad if one guy buys all the treasuries? I think you're going back to that story, Nicholas, that I discussed with Jeff Snyder. Very interesting story about that trader from Solomon Brothers in the early 1990s who is trying to bid higher than everyone else for every treasury issued at auction. And why is it bad? I don't think it was really bad. I think the government just couldn't figure it out, so they just assumed that he was doing something nefarious, and they never really put two and two together. But if you watched my video on it, the whiteboard video I did, that's the one with the thumbnail that says shadows, where I try to kind of explain some of the shadow banking stuff I discussed with Jeff Snyder. You'll see that I'm getting this from Jeff. What Jeff's opinion is, the gentleman, and a lot of others too. It wasn't just this guy. There were several traders at other investment banks who were doing the same type of thing, not just with treasuries, but with mortgage-backed securities. They saw the boom in the repo market and for international funding and the derivatives market exploding at the time. And they saw this opportunity. So they were trying to get as much pristine collateral as they possibly could, because they knew that they could leverage that collateral in the repo market and make a killing on it. And the government never put two and two together. But if you look at charts of the repo market and the derivatives market back in the early 1990s, and then in 2000 going to 2008, you see in the rearview mirror, and you're like, aha, this is what the guy saw. He saw the repo market going to explode throughout the decade, and he was trying to accumulate as much pristine collateral as he could. Is there a good book or course you recommend about all these real estate ratios? No, it's not really in a book, because I didn't come up with the RV ratio on my own. That's a metric I got from my good buddy Jason Hartman. But he actually measures it a little bit different than I do. He measures it on the value of the property, where I measure it on your cost basis. So maybe I probably should do it the way he does it, but I've always just done it on your cost basis, because that's what I'm looking at, my personal ROI. It's how much I have out of pocket. And so that kind of includes your ability or my ability to negotiate up front. And I've honed that skill over the past 8 years, to where now I'm really, really good at it. So my RV ratio is going to be quite a bit better than someone else in the exact same market, because in my opinion, I'm going to be able to get a better deal, and my price per square foot or price per square meter is going to be a lot lower, especially in Medellin, compared to other gringos. That's for sure. I pay about half of what the other gringos pay. So, that's why I do it on my cost basis. But no, I have not seen that in a book. It's just, I would suggest listening to Hartman's podcast. It's the Creating Wealth Show. And he goes through all of these ratios that he's thought about and put together over the years. That's where I first heard it. Now, another thing too, just FYI, I was just texting back and forth today with a guy I had dinner with the other night named Ken McElroy. And he's good buddies with my buddy Robert Kiyosaki. And we were all at dinner together. And Ken is actually the guy that does the majority of the real estate investing for Robert. A lot of people don't know that, but Robert makes, all this money doing a book, let's say, and then he takes that money and he says, "Okay, Ken, there you go. go make us a bunch of money in real estate." So Ken is his, I guess, rich dad advisor, if you want to call him that, for real estate investing. And, I spoke with Danielle DiMartino Booth on Friday. I don't know if you guys watched that episode of the Rebel Capitalist Show, but I went through kind of her chart deck that she sent me, and there is some scary stuff going on right now in real estate, not just residential, but in especially these hotels. My goodness gracious, they are levered up and they have big problems. And of course, everyone knows the issues with commercial real estate, with office space and retail. And I mean, there's going to be some massive destruction in that area. Maybe not residential with the starter homes, but I think there's an argument there where it's got a lot of tailwind. But with all these commercial buildings and retail space and office space and all these old malls that are just dead men walking, really. And it's tough not to be bearish when you listen to Danielle, and she's got all the facts right there. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, man, if you have that much destruction, there's going to be an opportunity in there. And it took me back to the conversation that I had with Ken and with Robert at dinner. And Ken was talking about some areas of opportunity that he sees, not now, but when the dust settles and when we have the crash, the collapse in commercial real estate coming out the other side, he's already formulating a game plan as to how he wants to take action. And he's specifically eyeing some of these old malls in Phoenix. I won't say which ones, but and he went through. I asked him, I said, "Well, what would you do with that mall? Like, what do you even like? How do you make money on that? What's the game plan there?" And he walked me through step by step what he would do. Brilliant. So I'll just kind of leave that as a teaser. And just FYI, I'm going to be interviewing Kenny on the 28th. So that's Ken McElroy. And we're going to be going over a lot of these strategies. So it's not just talking about how bad a shape the commercial real estate market is in. I think we all know that. But once it collapses, and at what price do you start buying, right? And then what's the game plan? How do you turn that into an opportunity? Which is what Ken's all about. So stay tuned for that interview, because I think you guys are going to get a kick out of it. I know I'm really looking forward to talking with him. Do you ever encounter language barriers in your travels? Do you speak Spanish or other languages fluently? That's a good question. And I think that is a roadblock that doesn't exist, that people create for themselves. And I mean, you can, even from a personal standpoint, like I've spent a lot of time in Medellin since 2015. In 2019, I spent almost a whole year there. But I'd spend, 3, 4, 5 months a year in Medellin. And I've never learned the language. I mean, it depends. If I'm like at a restaurant or in a taxi or a hotel, someplace where I got a lot of practice, then yeah, I can speak Spanish to the point where I can get my message across. Like I can order a coffee, I can order food. Or I can tell a taxi driver where to go. That's not a problem. But I couldn't have a fluid conversation with someone. There's no way. And think about that. So one thing that I did in Medellin is not only spend a lot of time there, but I started my own TV show in Medellin, where I was not only the producer of the TV show, I starred in the TV show. And I don't speak Spanish. And so what we did is it was with me, with Joaquin and Angie, and obviously they speak Spanish, they're Ecuadorian. And just whenever I had a part, I would speak and it would just be in subtitles. And then they would respond sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in English. And if they did it in English, there would just be subtitles. And the show was still wildly popular. And so my point is, I think a lot of people in life tend to create roadblocks that don't exist. And they turn, they make mountains out of molehills, if you want to use that term or that phrase. And I think if you just say, screw it, and yes, it's outside of my comfort zone, but you realize that you're not going to gain anything. You're not going to grow in life professionally or personally unless you're outside of your comfort zone. And you embrace that and you take the bull by the horn and you see that as a challenge that you can tackle and overcome, and just see it almost jokingly. Like, how many people would go down to the local TV station and try to pitch the executives, mind you, who speak Spanish, and have to take a translator and say, listen, I've got this great idea. I'm going to produce a TV show for you. I'm going to star in it. And I don't speak a word of English. No one, or not, maybe not no one, but very few people would be willing to do that, because they'd say, oh, I can't do that. I don't speak Spanish. They're just going to laugh me out of the office and blah, 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 blah. Where I saw it as, this is a no-brainer. They're going to love it. I don't care if I speak Spanish or not. We'll just make it happen. And these shows are wildly popular in the States, so they're going to be popular there. And I don't know the first thing about producing a TV show, but I'll figure it out. And I'm going to make the best TV show they've ever seen. And we're going to get the best ratings ever. And I truly believed that. And we got very close to achieving those objectives. And so I think as an entrepreneur, you just have this mindset where you shoot first and ask questions later. But I think if people had more of that mindset in their personal lives, they would do a lot better as well. Let's talk. I don't really talk about this too often because it's not really applicable. But I dated a few gals in Medellin and that didn't speak a word of English. And I'd go out with them, and I knew that I didn't speak Spanish. They didn't speak English. I don't care. Like, I could care less. Like, we're going to go out. We're going to have a great time, damn it. And I'm going to make sure we have a great time. I can promise you we're going to have a great time. And every single time, we had a blast. And I don't need to speak the language. I'll make it happen. And so you get my point. I think that don't worry about the language, man. Just dive in, baptism by fire, and just go down there. Whatever you want to do, Brandon, do it and just make it happen. And you'll learn as you go, and you'll figure it out. Oh, geez, it's already past 5 my time. Okay, so we've been on an hour. I did not realize that. Okay, guys, well, let me do some shout outs. And just remind everyone to check out Rebel Capitalist Pro. That is the online investment forum I have with Lynn Alden and Chris McIntosh. It's absolutely amazing. You guys are going to love it. It is the best way to build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments. So check it out at georgegammon.com/pro. All right, let me do some shout outs for everyone that was here. Nice enough to spend some time with me on this Sunday afternoon. And I want to thank you guys. We still have over 1,000 people. Great. Tony, SJ, Lewis, Kai, Jarrett, Travis, Jim, Zachary, Joe G's Craft, something cannabis. Skip it all around. Pratik, AJ, Peter, the intelligent CPA. All-Nighter, Heater, Mike, Duck Dive, Ursula, Nicholas, Patrick, Peter Bear R, Joker Alpha, Andre Matthews, Dwayne, Haircut Martin, Gregory, Freedom Stacker, Dennis, Huns and Roses. Whoa, very cool. I was just listening to some GNR the other day. All right, Mike, Boris, Lucas, Dwayne. Guys, thanks a lot for hanging out with me on this Sunday, and I will see you on the next video.